They say the quiet child is the easy one. The real truth is that the quiet child is the one paying attention. My name is Callum Voss, and I was 62 years old the evening my parents signed a family property over to my brother Dennis at the kitchen table of the house on Sycamore Ridge Road where I had grown up and where I had, without anyone's knowledge, been keeping a record since the spring of 1994. The kitchen in that house had a low ceiling,
if you like
and yellow
the story,
walls, and a window
join
above
our
the sink
community by
that
hitting
faced
that
the
like
button
button
and
The
subscribing.
linoleum
for more
floor
real,
had a crack
raw,
along
and
far
family
edge
centered
that had been there
stories.
since I was 9
And as
years old.
always, Dennis had
Thank
no
you for being
idea
a part
what
of
was
this
sitting in the
fear.
manila accordion file I had carried into that room under my arm. Welcome back to channel where silence is never surrender. If you've ever been the one who did the work while someone else collected the credit, this story is for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. Callum Voss had been born the second son in a household that organized itself, without ever saying so directly, around the assumption that the first son was the one who mattered. The house on Sycamore Ridge Road sat on 11 acres of mixed farmland and timber in rural Bledsoe County, Tennessee. The nearest town was Pikeville, 14 miles east on a two-lane road that flooded twice every spring. My father, Harold James Voss, had worked that land for 40 years and had purchased the adjacent timber parcel in 1978. Using a personal loan, he paid off over 9 years. My mother, Ruth Ellen Voss, had kept the household accounts in a ledger she stored in the drawer beneath the telephone. She was precise and careful and entirely devoted to my brother Dennis in a way she would not have described as favoritism, though that is what it was. Dennis Voss was 4 years older than me. He was loud in a way that certain people are loud, not from excess energy, but from a belief that volume established authority. He had left Bledsoe County at 22, moved to Chattanooga, and worked in equipment sales for most of his adult life. He visited the house on Sycamore Ridge Road at Thanksgiving and at Christmas, and occasionally in the summer when he wanted to fish the creek at the back of the property. He had never once helped my father with the land. He had never once helped my mother with anything that required physical presence over time. I had lived 42 miles away in Dayton, Tennessee, since 1989, in a house on Garfield Street with my wife, Miriam Louise Voss, who passed away from a pulmonary embolism on April 7th, 2016, at 4:22 in the morning, 11 days after we were told she was recovering from a routine surgery. Miriam had been a schoolteacher for 27 years. She had a particular way of folding the newspaper in half before she read it, and a laugh that came out of her without warning. And I have not been able to explain to anyone who did not know her why the house on Garfield Street has felt different in every room since she died. I had driven to Sycamore Ridge Road every third Saturday for 21 years to help my father with whatever the property required. In the early years, this meant fencing and equipment maintenance, and the seasonal work of clearing timber from the back 40 after a hard winter. In the later years, as my father's health declined, it meant sitting with him while he gave instructions, and then doing what needed doing alone, because Dennis was in Chattanooga, and the land did not wait for convenient schedules. I had paid the property tax on my parents' home for 11 consecutive years, beginning in 2009, when my father's income from the land became insufficient to cover it, drawing from my own savings account at First Tennessee Bank on Garfield Street, and never once mentioning it to either of my parents, because it was not something I had done to be mentioned. I had replaced the roof on the main house in the summer of 2013, hiring a crew from Pikeville and covering the cost myself, $8,400, because the roof had been failing for 2 winters, and my father was 81 years old, and my brother had said, when I called him, that he was between positions at the moment and couldn't swing it. The accordion file had existed since April of 1994. I had started at the spring after my father had a mild cardiac event, and I had driven to Sycamore Ridge Road at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night to sit in the hospital waiting room in Pikeville while Dennis remained in Chattanooga. I had kept, from that night forward, a record of every specific act I performed for my parents. The date, the nature of the act, the costs where applicable, and the time I spent. I had not started the file out of resentment. I had started it the way a careful person starts any record, because the work was real, and real work deserved an accounting, and I had learned from my father's own ledger keeping that the things you do not write down are the things that eventually go unremembered. The file sat in the bottom drawer of my desk on Garfield Street for 30 years. It was 3 inches thick by the time I carried it to Sycamore Ridge Road on the evening of February 9th, 2024. My father's attorney was a man named Calvin Rees, estate and property law, offices on Main Street in Pikeville, Tennessee, who had handled Harold Voss's affairs since 1981. Calvin Rees was 74 years old, methodical, and entirely without interest in drama of any kind. He had prepared the transfer documents my parents were about to sign, and he was present at the table that evening as the notarizing witness. He had called me at 3:15 p.m. on February 7th to confirm the meeting time, and during that call, which lasted 6 minutes, I had asked him one question about the legal standing of documented personal expenditures made on behalf of a property owner over an extended period. He had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said he would look into it and call me back. He had called me back at 5:48 p.m. the same day. The kitchen on Sycamore Ridge Road smelled that evening of coffee and in particular dry warmth of an old house with a wood stove running in February. The overhead light above the table had always been slightly too dim, and my father had always refused to replace the bulb with anything brighter because he said bright lights at night were a city habit. My mother had put a plate of sliced cake on the table that no one touched. Dennis sat across from me with his elbows on the table and the expression of a man who had already decided how the evening would conclude. My father set the transfer documents on the table at 6:30 p.m. My mother placed her hands in her lap. Calvin Rees uncapped his pen. "We want to do this while we still can," my father said, "while things are clear." I said, "I understand. Dennis is going to take over the property management." My father said, "He'll handle everything going forward." Dennis nodded. He did not look at me. My throat tightened once briefly. I kept both hands flat on the table. "All right," I said. Dennis had arrived at the house on Sycamore Ridge Road at 4 p.m., 2.5 hours before Calvin Rees. I had arrived at 4:45. The February light outside was flat and gray, and the field behind the house was still carrying patches of old snow along the fence line. My mother had made coffee. The wood stove in the corner ticked with heat. Dennis was already seated at the kitchen table when I came in. With a yellow legal pad in front of him and a pen, he kept clicking. "Bobby," he said, which was a name I had not used for 40 years, and which he knew I had not used for 40 years. He said it the way people say a diminutive name when they want to establish a particular kind of distance. I set my coat on the chair by the door. I set the accordion file on the floor beside my chair. Dennis glanced at it once and looked away. My mother brought coffee. The cups were the same white cups she had used since 1971. My father came in from the back hallway moving slowly, the way he had moved since the second cardiac event in 2019. He sat at the head of the table with the particular deliberateness of a man who has decided something and does not intend to revisit it. For the first hour before Calvin Rees arrived, the conversation was about the property. Dennis did most of the talking. He had, it emerged, been preparing for this evening for longer than I had understood. "The timber parcel alone is worth developing," Dennis said. "I've already had a conversation with a land broker in Chattanooga." My father said, "It's good timber. It's better than timber at this point," Dennis said. "The right developer could put 12 lots back there." I said, "Dad bought that parcel to preserve it." Dennis looked at me with the patient expression of someone addressing a child's misunderstanding. "Dad bought it when lumber prices made preservation practical. That's not the current situation." I said nothing. My father said, "Dennis has a plan worked out." I looked at my father. My chest went very still. "When did you talk to broker?" I said, "We've been talking for a while." Dennis said, "It takes time to do these things right." I looked at my mother. She was looking at the plate of sliced cake. "How long?" I said. "Long enough." Dennis said, "Bobby, this isn't a discussion. Mom and Dad asked me to take this on. I've been doing the planning. It's handled." I said nothing. The room was quiet except for the stove. Dennis set his legal pad on the table and tapped it once with his pen. "There's a lot to manage here. It needs someone with the bandwidth." "The bandwidth," I said. "Someone who can move on it." Dennis said, "Someone local to the decision-making." "I've been driving here every third Saturday for 21 years, I said. "And we appreciate that," my mother said, quickly, in the tone she used when she wanted conversation to end. I kept my face level. I kept my voice even. Something in me at that moment went very flat. The way water goes flat in a container when everything that was moving in it has finally stilled. I picked up my coffee cup. I set it down. I did not say anything else before Calvin Rees arrived. When Calvin came through the door at 6:15 p.m., stamping the February mud from his boots in the entryway, the temperature in the kitchen had shifted in the way the temperature shifts when the thing everyone has been building toward is about to happen. He took his coat off and hung it on the hook by the door and set his briefcase on the counter. He was a careful man. He did not rush. Dennis watched him unpack the transfer documents with the expression of a man watching formality. My father looked at the documents for a moment. Then he picked up the pen Calvin offered. "We always meant to do right by both boys," my father said. He was looking at the table when he said it. Dennis said, "That's what this is, Dad." My mother said nothing. I said nothing. My father signed the first document at 6:31 p.m. Dennis said, "It's the right call." He said it to no one in particular, which meant he said it to me. I had paid my parents' property tax for 11 consecutive years. I had covered the roof in 2013. I had driven 240 miles round trip every third Saturday for 2 decades, in good weather and in February ice and in the weeks after Miriam died, when driving was the only thing I could think to do. I had arranged my father's hospital discharge in October 2019, driving to Pikeville at 6 a.m. on a Thursday and staying through the afternoon to speak with the attending physician and coordinate the home health aid schedule for the following 3 weeks. I had paid for the home health aid for those 3 weeks, $1,460 from my own account, because the timing between Medicare and my parents' supplemental coverage had left a gap, and I had not mentioned it to Dennis because Dennis was in Chattanooga, and I had not wanted to have that conversation. My second named professional entered the evening at 6:47 p.m. Her name was Dr. Sylvia Marsh, a physician and family medicine practitioner at Bledsoe County Medical Center, whose patient Harold James Voss had been for 19 years. At 6:47 p.m., while Calvin Rees was preparing the second transfer document, my father said something that caused Dennis to lean forward. My father had, for the preceding 3 months, been experiencing intermittent confusion that he had not disclosed to Dennis, but that I knew about because I had spoken with Dr. Marsh directly, having called her at 9:10 a.m. on December 12th to ask about the progression and what it meant for decisions of significance. Dr. Marsh had been careful and precise. She had not told me what to do. She had told me what the medical picture was. I had written it down. Dennis said, after my father's comment at 6:47, "He's just tired. Let's keep moving." My mother said, "It's been a long day for him." I looked at Calvin Rees. Calvin looked at the document in front of him and was quiet for 3 seconds. "Harold," Calvin said, "do you want to take a moment?" "I'm fine," my father said. "Let's finish." I said nothing. Dennis said, "Bobby, don't make this harder than it needs to be." I kept my hands flat on the table. My voice, when I finally spoke, was completely level. "I'm not making it anything." "You're sitting there with that look," Dennis said. "What look?" I said. "Like you're keeping score," he said. I said nothing. The second document was signed at 6:58 p.m. Dennis leaned back in his chair and put his hands behind his head. "You never contributed," he said, addressing me directly. "I know that's hard to hear, but this family carried you for decades, Bobby. You live your own life. Mom and Dad understand that. This is just how it worked out." My stomach dropped, and then it settled, and then it was simply still. I looked at Dennis for a moment. Then I looked at my father. My father was looking at the table. I reached down and lifted the accordion file from the floor and set on the table in front of me. I need to go back, because the accordion file on that table did not arrive there by accident. I had been at my desk on Garfield Street in Dayton at 7:15 p.m. on February 7th, 2024, 2 days before the Sycamore Ridge Road meeting, when Calvin Rees had called me back. The desk was in the second bedroom, which had been Miriam's marking room, and which still smelled faintly of the red pen she had used on student papers. The window above the desk faced a side yard. The streetlight outside had been flickering for 3 weeks, and the power company had not yet come to fix it. The accordion file was open on the desk in front of me, and I had been going through it page by page since 6 p.m. Calvin Rees said, "I looked into your question." And I said, "The short answer," he said, is that documented personal expenditures made on behalf of a property owner over an extended period without expectation of repayment can in some circumstances constitute a claim against the estate if the expenditures can be shown to preserve or enhance the property's value. I said, "What does that require?" "Documentation," he said. "Specific, dated, itemized documentation." I looked at the accordion file. "I have documentation," I said. There was a pause. "How much documentation?" he said. 30 years, I said. Calvin was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he said, "Robert, I want to be careful here. I am your parents' attorney. I am not your attorney. What I can tell you is that if you have documentation of the kind you are describing, you should have your own legal representation review it before that meeting." I said, "I understand." I called an attorney named Dora Fenwick at 8:02 p.m. that same evening. Dora K. Fenwick, Estate and Property Law, offices on Market Street in Dayton, Tennessee, who had handled Miriam's estate after 2016 and whom I had worked with on 2 subsequent matters and trusted completely. I told her what I had. I told her what Calvin had said. She asked me to bring the file to her office the following morning. I sat at that desk for another hour. After I hung up, the street light flickered. The house was quiet. Miriam's red pen was still in the cup on the corner of the desk where she had always kept it. I thought about what Dennis had said on the phone 3 months earlier, when I had called to discuss our parents' health and the question of what came next. He had said, with the relaxed certainty of a man who had already made arrangements, that he and our parents had been talking, and that things were mostly settled. I had asked what settled meant. He had said it meant he was going to be the one managing things going forward. I had asked whether I would be involved. He had paused and said, "Bobby, you've got your own life up there in Dayton. Let's not make this complicated." I had set the phone down after that call and sat at the same desk and looked at the accordion file in the bottom drawer. The question I had been sitting with was not whether to act. The question was what kind of act was proportionate. I was not looking to take anything from my parents. The house on Sycamore Ridge Road was their house and their decision. What I was not willing to do was sit at their kitchen table and be told I had never contributed and say nothing in response while it was factually untrue, and while a record of that factual untruth existed in a file 30 years deep. I was not there to win something. I was there to be accurately seen. Dora Fenwick had reviewed the file at her office on Market Street on the morning of February 8 for 2 hours. She had flagged 17 specific line items that she described as legally significant, documented expenditures totaling $43,200 over 21 years, each dated, each itemized, each traceable to a specific account. She had prepared a 1-page summary on her letterhead and placed it at the front of the file. She had told me, before I left, that I did not need to do anything with this. She had said that the document existed, and that its existence changed the legal landscape of the property transfer, and that what I chose to do with that change was entirely my decision. I had thanked her and driven home on the empty February highway, and sat in the driveway on Garfield Street for 11 minutes before I went inside. Something low in me had gone very quiet and very clear, the way a room goes clear when someone finally turns on the right light. Dennis believed, after the second document was signed at 6:58 p.m., that the evening was over. He had leaned back in his chair. He had made his comment about contribution and carrying. He had watched me for a reaction and received what appeared to be silence. The accordion file was on the table in front of me, but he had dismissed it. I had seen the dismissal in the single glance he gave it when I set it down. It was a manila folder in an old accordion binder, faded at the edges, with a rubber band around it that had gone brittle from years in a desk drawer. Dennis looked at it the way people look at things they have already decided are irrelevant. My mother had begun clearing the coffee cups. Calvin Rees had capped his pen and was stacking the signed documents into his briefcase with the careful movements of a man who had done this many times. Dennis said to my father, "We should talk about the broker contact this week. Get the timber parcel conversation moving." My father said, "All right." Dennis said, "There's real value there. The market timing is good." My father nodded slowly. I said, "The timber parcel was purchased to preserve the back 40 from development. That's in the original purchase documentation." Dennis looked at me with patient exasperation. "Bobby, the transfer is signed. This is not a committee." I said nothing. Dennis said to Calvin, "What's the process of the title transfer going forward?" Calvin said, "The documents go to the county clerk's office for recording. Standard process. Should be complete within 2 to 3 weeks." Dennis said, "Good." He tapped the table once with his palm. "Good." He looked at me with the expression of a man who had prepared to be magnanimous now that the outcome was secured. "No hard feelings," he said. "This is what Mom and Dad wanted. You'll still be family. Nothing changes." My throat was even. My hands were even. My voice, when I spoke, was level and without inflection. "I have a few things I'd like to put on the table," I said. Dennis looked at me. Then he looked at the accordion file. "Bobby," he said. "Robert," I said. He was quiet. My mother had stopped moving at the counter. My father was looking at the table. Calvin Rees had not yet closed his briefcase. In the weeks between Calvin's February 7 call and this evening, my third-name professional had made a specific move. Her name was Dora K. Fenwick, estate and property law, Market Street in Dayton, Tennessee. On February 8th at 4:17 p.m., she had filed a formal notice of potential equitable claim with the Bledsoe County Register of Deeds, citing documented personal expenditures made by Robert Callum Voss on behalf of Harold James Voss and Ruth Ellen Voss over a period of 21 years, and requesting that no property transfer be recorded as final pending review of said claim. The notice had been filed as a precautionary instrument, not a lawsuit. It was 4 paragraphs long. It was now sitting in the county registrar's office, which meant that when Calvin Rees submitted the transfer documents for recording, the clerk would flag the notice before processing. Calvin Rees knew this. I had told her on the phone on February 9th at 2 p.m., 1 hour before I drove to Sycamore Ridge Road. He had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, "I see." Then he had said he would be present this evening in his capacity as notary, which was his legal obligation. He had not said anything further. Dennis did not know any of this. He was looking at the accordion file on the table. My breath was even. My chest was even. Something in my hands had gone entirely still. "Open it," I said. Dennis opened it. He took off the brittle rubber band. He lifted the flap. He pulled out the 1-page summary on Dora Fenwick's letterhead and read it. He read it twice. His face went still. Not frozen, still. The difference, as I have come to understand it, is that frozen is a reaction, still is a recognition. I said nothing. My mother came back to the table. She stood at the end and looked at the paper in Dennis's hand. Dennis said, "What is this?" "It's a summary," I said. "The full file is behind it." Dennis set the summary down. He lifted the first section of the accordion file and looked at it. The pages were organized by year, each year tabbed with a piece of masking tape on which I had written the year in blue pen. 1994, 1995, 1996. He flipped through several sections without reading them closely. Then he closed the file and set it on the table. "You've been building a case against us," he said. "I've been keeping a record," I said. "It's the same thing." "It isn't," I said. Calvin Rees said from his end of the table, "Dennis, the notice filed with the Register of Deeds means the title transfer cannot be recorded as final until the equitable claim is reviewed. That a legal matter, not a personal one." Dennis looked at Calvin. His jaw had gone tight. "You knew about this," Dennis said to him. "I was informed this afternoon," Calvin said. "My obligation this evening was as notary for the documents. That obligation is complete. What happens with the recording is a separate matter." My father said from the head of the table, "What does that mean? What does that mean for the property?" I looked at my father. Something low in my chest went very still and very full at the same time, the way a room feels when something important has finally been said aloud in it. "It means the transfer isn't final yet, Dad," I said. "It means there's time to do this right." My mother sat down. Dennis said, "Bobby, you cannot." "Robert," I said, "and I already have." Dennis looked at the file. He looked at Calvin. He looked at me. His hands were on the table, flat, and they did not move. I said nothing. I reached across and picked up the accordion file. I set it on my lap. I looked at my father. "I don't want the property," I said. "I never wanted the property. I wanted to be on the record that I was here. That's all." My father looked at me for a long moment. The overhead light above the table was still too dim. The stove still ticked. Outside the kitchen window, the February field was dark. "I know you were here," my father said. My eyes stung once, briefly, at the corners. Then they did not. I nodded once. I stood up. I picked up my coat. I shook Calvin Reese's hand. I said good night to my mother. I put the accordion file under my arm, and I walked out of the kitchen on Sycamore Ridge Road and out through the front door and stood in the February dark for a moment before I got in the truck. The field was quiet. The stars were very clear the way they are in February in Bledsoe County, when the temperature has dropped and the air has no moisture left in it. I drove home. Dora Fenwick filed the formal equitable claim on February 14th, 2024, 5 days after the family meeting. The claim was not for property. It was for reimbursement of $43,200 in documented person expenditures, with interest accrued at the statutory rate for the applicable period. The Bledsoe County Register of Deeds declined to record the property transfer as final pending resolution of the claim, per standard procedure. Dennis called me on February 16th at 11:22 a.m. The conversation lasted 17 minutes. He said several things during that conversation, and I said very few. What he arrived at by the end of it was a question. What did I actually want? I told him what I had told my father in the kitchen. I did not want the property. I want a written acknowledgement, signed by both parents and by Dennis, that the expenditures documented in the file had occurred and had been made voluntarily and without expectation of repayment, and that they constitute a contribution to the family's interests over 21 years. Dennis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's it?" "That's it," I said. The acknowledgement was signed on March 3rd, 2024, at Calvin Reese's office on Main Street in Pikeville. My parents signed it. Dennis signed it. Calvin notarized it. I have the original. Dora Fenwick has a certified copy. The property transfer was recorded as final on March 7th. Dennis and I have spoken twice since then. The conversations were brief and without warmth, and that is how I expect they will continue to be for a long time. My parents are still in the house on Sycamore Ridge Road. My father's health is what it is. I drive there every third Saturday. The accordion file is back in the bottom drawer of my desk on Garfield Street. I do not think I will ever need it again. I kept it open on the desk for 2 days after I brought it home from Pikeville, looking through it. Not because I needed to review it, but because it represented 30 years of showing up, and I wanted to sit with that for a while before I put it away. Miriam would have understood this precisely. She had been a person who believed that the things you do in the absence of witnesses are the things that constitute your actual character. She had said this to me once, not in a significant moment but in passing, on an ordinary evening, and I had not forgotten it. Robert Callum Voss, 62 years old, and still driving the Sycamore Ridge Road every third Saturday. The difference between a record and a grievance is intent. I had not kept that file out of grievance. I had kept out of the same instinct that made my father keep a ledger and my mother keep the household accounts, because the work was real, and real work belongs in writing. What Dennis called keeping score was simply the habit of a man who understood that everything that actually happens deserves to be remembered accurately. The file existed. That was enough. Robert Voss, 62 years old, and still keeping the record straight. Tell me, if you had been sitting at that kitchen table on Sycamore Ridge Road when Dennis opened that file and read Dora Fenwick's summary, what would you have said next? Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.